You know, for someone who constantly talks about his desire for more horror-like media for kids, I was very adverse to being scared as a kid myself. One Halloween, when I was about 4 or 5 and rocking a sweet Tigger costume, I remember walking down the pathway to my neighbor Bob's house, and said Bob being bathed in a dark, purplish light, wearing an alien mask as creepy music played and flashing headlights flickered around him. Sensing my fear, good old Bobbert tried to reassure me that it was only him, but that was right before a disembodied voice yelled, "Look out," and what I remember to be a fake spider dropping down in front of my face. You know, my crippling arachnophobia makes more sense now. All I can remember after that incident is gazing at my shadow as I sprinted 3 houses down to my childhood home, shut the door, and forever after stayed well away from Scary Bob's House of Horrors. Perhaps consequently, I stayed well away from horror media for much of my childhood too. Oh sure, I could watch movies with scary elements in them. Disney's Sleepy Hollow, the Night on Bald Mountain segment of Fantasia. You could sit me down in front of many of those scenes and I'd mostly be fine. But straight up horror? No thanks, fam. As I grew up and started to expand my interests, I started to at least become fright curious. I'm sorry. Probably helped by my interest in less intense horror affairs, like Wait Until Dark, Psycho, or Coraline. Well, mostly less intense. My aversion to more classic horror still stood though. No slashers, no killers, no psychological trauma at the crushing weight of life's responsibilities, and absolutely no demonic forces of evil. All of that changed, however, with one film riding the coattails of a very demonic trend throughout the mid-70s. The Omen is the third in what I call the very loose Christian horror trilogy, revolving around Hollywood Satanism, supernatural events, and of course, the worst thing you could ever put in a movie.
Boom. A child. No.
Many people cite The Exorcist as the beginning of this fad, but I believe a more accurate starting point is the 1968 adaptation of Rosemary's Baby, which probably played a great deal in bringing concepts like contemporary witchcraft, demonic influence of the mundane, and the Antichrist to the public consciousness.
What have you done to him, you maniac?
Satan is his father, not Guy.
The Exorcist, however, was much more influential in its depiction of demonic influence over innocent families and children.
I'm Damien Counts.
And I'm the devil.
It didn't hurt that on top of being the highest-grossing film at the domestic box office in 1973, The Exorcist was nominated for many prestigious film awards, even being the first horror film to gain the nomination for Best Picture at the Academy Awards. It didn't win, obviously, but for movie studios, a nomination is as good as a win, and Hollywood's greatest producers smelled Oscar-winning blood in the water. There were a lot of religious-based horror movies that came out in the wake of The Exorcist, but 20th Century Fox's The Omen was among the first to gain widespread recognition and success, mostly due to the advertising emphasizing the film's release date, June 6th, 1976, at least in the UK. And one day, almost 34 years later, I happened to stumble on a bit of music from the film that, if you'll pardon the pun, spooked the hell out of me. It was pretty much a meme in 2010 internet to play the demonic and Oscar-nominated theme song, Ave Satani, over a relatively mundane scene. And just the small snippets I heard piqued my interest enough to seek out more. This was also around the time when entire movies could be uploaded to YouTube by unofficial sources, and, if you were lucky, weren't immediately taken down by copyright. This is how I first found and watched The Omen. And boy howdy, let me tell you, for someone who didn't watch a lot of horror films, this was like opening the Ark of the Covenant at the end of Raiders. Starts out fine at first, a little foreboding and atmospheric, but surprisingly beautiful in its cinematography with just a dash of sweet Jesus! While a lot of the more iconic sequences in this film are pretty tame by today's standards. For Baby's first horror film, there was a lot in this movie that unnerved me to no end. This made it a hard film to completely get out of my mind, and it lingered rent-free in my head for months after. But unlike other examples of horror that brought anxious terror to my every waking moment, this movie and its emphasis on character and atmosphere over out-and-out scares made me absolutely entranced by it, as if I had been possessed by some terrible demonic force sent from the deepest furnace of "Aw, puppy!" The movie follows American ambassador to Great Britain, Robert Thorne, played by Gregory Peck, who, on one unusually dark June morning in Rome, receives the news that his son has tragically died in childbirth. Fearing what this news would do to his wife, Catherine, played by Remake, he secretly adopts a child whose mother also died in childbirth, treating him as their own and naming him Damien. The years pass by without incident, but on Damien's 5th birthday, tragedy strikes rather suddenly.
Look at me, Damien. It's all for you.
Well, you get the picture.
Stranger events happen still, like when Damien violently refuses to go near a church, or animals at the zoo either avoid or attack him, and it seems that everywhere the young Thorne goes, death is sure to follow. Or rather, in the words of a very optimistic painter, happy little accidents.
Pleasant place. Everything's nice here.
After one such accident nearly kills his wife, Robert teams up with photographer Keith Jennings, played by David Warner, who has been investigating the mysterious deaths surrounding the Thorne family, and the two soon follow the origins of Damien all the way to a horrible revelation of apocalyptic proportions. Of course, in the biblical account of Revelation, the Antichrist wasn't supposed to be the literal son of Satan. It was meant to be an allegory of any false shepherd or prophet that used the word of Jesus for their own means. So really, the Antichrist could be anything from a cult leader, televangelist, or any person in higher power claiming to be of God, but really is only interested in their own wealth and power.
I think you're fucking Antichrist.
But I mean, it's not like such people exist in real life, nor would I ever imply any such person exists. No siree, not little old me. Nope, nope, nope. Anyway, that hasn't stopped pop culture depictions of the biblical end times from casting the Antichrist as Satan's flesh and blood.
That brand new baby smell.
And while he wasn't the first, the Omen's Damien has all but cemented the idea of a literal son of Satan in the cultural lexicon. However, unlike other examples in this cultural lexicon, the Omen's take on the origin to Armageddon is much more subtle and understated in its approach. When he was first given the script, the late Richard Donner was put off the idea of directing it because of its heavy use of satanic imagery and much more blatant demonic influence. Not for any religious concern, but mainly because he didn't find it very interesting. Rather, he wanted to rework the script into a more ambiguous direction, where one could read all the happy little accidents that happen as just that, accidents. Something that the original screenwriter, David Seltzer, was reluctant to do. Not for nothing, but this is the same David Seltzer who's responsible for this little nugget of joy.
Now I am gonna be sick.
Ultimately, Donner's interpretation would win out. And in the final cut, while there's more than enough evidence to suggest that something supernatural is definitely afoot, there's still enough plausible deniability that one could read the events of this film as completely mundane, and that what we're really witnessing is the slow degradation of a family amidst a terrible lie at the root of their adopted son's birth. Sequels notwithstanding. This, in my opinion, is the biggest thing The Omen has going for it, so that it's not just another well-made Exorcist ripoff. While I'll admit the most literal reading of this movie is the one that makes the most sense, even when viewed as a standalone story, that air of mundane abnormality hangs over the premise like a dark cloud, almost gaslighting you into thinking that Damien really is just a normal little kid. I mean, look at him, he's the cutest damn thing you ever saw.
Hold my hand.
Right.
Most supernatural movies that start with a more ambiguous angle almost always end up being literal takes on demonic forces attacking a mundane family anyway. So I wouldn't say Damien literally being the Antichrist takes away the impact of the film. But even with that literal reading, The Omen never fully embraces its demonic edge in the way that Rosemary's Baby or The Exorcist did. However, there's plenty of masterful work that leaves their presence very much apparent. The first thing that should be addressed is that 20th Century Fox spared no expense in terms of contemporary star power, with many great British character actors like Martin Benson, Patrick Troughton, and Robert Rietti filling out the supporting cast, and all playing off the almost regal performance of Gregory Peck with convincing reality. In fact, that was one of the things that David Warner reflected when he and Peck began filming their scenes investigating the origins of the Antichrist.
If we can convince them that with this, we all deserve Oscars. And that's what he said.
Gregory Peck commands such an air of respect in every movie he did that you have no choice but to believe the confliction, sorrow, and horror that Robert goes through. The tender moments he shares with his wife, with Lee Remick's soft and vulnerable performance, mirroring something of a classical ingenue from old Hollywood, are some of the best scenes that establish why we should care about these characters in any horror movie I've seen. And it's really no different than watching the number of teens from the Halloween or Friday the 13th movies establish the bare minimum of their character traits, so that you're well aware of who they are before they're sent to the chopping block. But when such exposition is done as well as this, where we see a genuine and loving marriage between Robert and Catherine, we just have to root for them, even if we know things won't end well. Or maybe I'm just a romantic softie, all the same. The authenticity of their performances goes a long way in contrasting the terrible things that begin to happen around and to this family. You start to empathize with their plight, and wonder if you wouldn't start to grow cold towards your son after he nearly tore your hair out to avoid a wedding, or seemingly started a riot amongst baboons. And Kathy obviously hates herself for her growing unease and standoffishness towards her son, who, as far as she knows, is just a little kid who had a bad spell, and just happened to be with her when those baboons went crazy. But again, after everything that's happened around him, not the least of which accidentally knocking her off the balcony of their sizable house, you'd probably start to get the suspicion that your cute little 5-year-old might want you dead too.
Don't let him kill me. Don't let him kill me.
Damien's guilt in this particular accident is dubious, though, as it's really the involvement of the film's unsung hero that caused Kathy's fateful fall. This hero being Billy Whitelaw's incredibly chilling Mrs. Baylock.
Have no fear, little one. I am here to protect thee.
Of all of horror's greatest and most feared monsters, Mrs. Willa Baylock, yeah, according to Wikipedia, her first name is Willa? Weird. Is by far the most underappreciated. From the moment she reveals her true colors to Damien, where before she addressed the Thorns as a humble and soft-spoken nanny, there's a chill in the air that permeates every scene she's in. This is a person who knows Damien's true purpose, even if he doesn't himself yet, and her quiet acts of defiance in order to undermine Robert and Kathy's authority and plant herself as Damien's sole guardian is part of that understated horror that this movie does so well. To have someone who is supposed to be helping you with your kid secretly try to steal that kid right out from under you, orchestrating little accidents to cut out the middleman between her and your child? Pretty spooky. And Billy Whitelaw effortlessly switches between unimposing and terrifying with just a simple look. Mrs. Baylock does not get the praise she deserves as a villain, and Billy Whitelaw remains a very underrated actress even years after her death. I've enjoyed her in every movie I've seen that she's in, which is fairly few in the grand scheme of her entire filmography, but she's still a huge scene stealer no less.
Oh, I see. It's fascism.
Fascism?
wonderful.
The one thing you have to talk about when addressing this movie, though, is the spellbinding score by the late, great Jerry Goldsmith. While probably not as recognizable a name compared to his peers like John Williams or Elmer Bernstein, Goldsmith nonetheless composed a number of scores and themes that are still considered among the greatest in film or TV. The Next Generation theme from Star Trek, Gremlins, Planet of the Apes, the frickin' original music for Soarin' Over California, all Goldsmith, all bangers. While many of his compositions would be nominated for Best Original Score, The Omen is the only film he scored that would ever win, and rightfully so. The soundtrack for the original Omen is like a character unto itself, which, if you put it that way, makes several scenes featuring the disembodied Latin chorus worshipping Satan even more terrifying. I'll be quite honest, even for how well acted this movie is, there are times when the more infamous sequences are so overdone that they could almost be melodrama. I mean, look at the scene where Patrick Troughton's father Brennan is running away from a storm without the music.
Oh, gee, the storm is really picking up. Oh, I gotta get out of here. Oh, gee, the fence is locked. I guess I'll climb over it. Oh, gee, that lightning strike was really close. Hey, guys, let me in. It's cold out here. My hair's getting all messy. Oh, gee, the door's locked. What do I do?
Now here's that same scene with the music played over it. And that's not even the limit to how frantic and, dare I say, demonic this score can get. The Omen is the go-to example for me on how a movie's score can elevate it beyond what we see from the performances, cinematography, lighting, and all that other technical jazz. Without the dark, ominous chanting, a lot of the scenes from this film would probably work fine enough, but lose that evil edge that gives this movie such a cursed feeling. Even beyond all the rumors surrounding its production that posit some satanic force trying to prevent its release. Goldsmith would go on to compose the scores for the remaining 2 films in the original Omen trilogy, and the consistency of the quality in his music is pretty much the only thing all 3 films have going for them as a whole. The greatest indication as to what this movie might be like without this chilling score, though, is the remake released 30 years later in 2006. Get it? June 6, 2006? I can hardly blame them for taking advantage of that. A lot of the score for that movie remains very understated, almost as understated as much of the original movie. But it really doesn't do the subject matter justice. I don't mean to knock composer Marco Beltrami for it. I don't envy anyone who would have to follow Goldsmith's score in any capacity, but the whole soundtrack feels much more generic and lessens the impact of a lot of key scenes because of it. Granted, there wasn't much to work with the remake as a whole, but that's a whole other can of worms that I don't care to open. I will say, though, the mistake that the remake and a lot of media surrounding The Omen have made in the past 45 years since its release is that they seem to have forgotten the understated emphasis on character over outright supernatural intervention. The deaths in each preceding Omen sequel got more and more over the top, and while some are still pretty impressive for their time, they lost the angle on how these events could just be happy little accidents, especially once Damien became more aware of his dark lineage, and took on the role of main killer, a la Jason Voorhees or Michael Myers or any other slasher villain. There's a lot I can say for Damien's character, or lack thereof, in these movies and the TV show that followed him, but that's best saved for its own video somewhere down the line. In the original Omen, however, it's understandable that he's not exactly the focal viewpoint, even if he is the most important character. He's 5, he's not gonna have very compelling thoughts beyond the latest episode of the Banana Splits show. The compromise, then, is to make him endearing enough that you don't want to see any harm come to him. You want to protect him almost as much as Mrs. Baylock does. But at the same time, he's kinda the devil incarnate, presenting a real conflict of interest. And much like biblical scripture, where it describes Satan as a beautiful deceiver, Damien is the immaculate image of a modern young boy, arousing no suspicion on his own outside the terrible events that happen around him.
Am I a stinker?
Much of the preceding depictions of Damien, though, would almost always throw away this inconspicuous side of him, and it's especially egregious in the remake. I mean, no offense, but Look at this kid. You look at this little shit and tell me he's not the devil. And I don't mean the kid himself. I've seen interviews with him at the time. He was your average 5-year-old kid. But in the movie proper, how could you not think he was the devil? Just look at him! There's just a certain level of overall craft that goes into a movie like The Omen that is hard to replicate. And if nothing else, the remake proved that tremendously. And while obviously you can't attribute absolutely everything great about a movie to the director, it was Richard Donner's insistence that the movie have a much more grounded take that cemented its natural, almost casual horror, while still feeling like a grandiose religious story of the beginning of the end. He directed a few smaller movies up to this point, but The Omen was his first foray into a much bigger production. Granted, the budget wasn't huge compared to contemporary blockbusters, but what they did with the money they had, and the emphasis on the Thorne family and their struggle to cope with their world crumbling around them, helped The Omen stand out in my mind, even if, as a 16-year-old, I wasn't quite able to articulate why I liked it so much. Especially when, as I've said before, I had such a huge aversion to the horror genre as a whole. But now, thanks to The Omen, I'm much more receptive to the genre, and welcome a good scare every so often. I went back and watched The Exorcist. I watched Rosemary's Baby. I've seen movies since then that scare the absolute piss out of me even worse than any of those other movies combined. But I've never lost my appreciation of the original Omen, and I don't think Richard Donner ever did either.
I became the fruit of the month in Hollywood. My whole career was turned around literally overnight. I owe Omen everything.
I trick-or-treated on Halloween for as long as I possibly could. But every year I would avoid Scary Bob's house, thanks to that frankly traumatizing event when I was but a wee Tigger. But one Halloween, I can't exactly remember which one, I finally resolved in myself to march down that familiar pathway, right up to Bob's front door, and get my goddamn candy from him that was at least a decade overdue. I don't remember the decorations he put up that year, nor what type of candy I even got from him, but I remember the satisfaction I felt finally conquering something that, in hindsight, was no big deal after all. In a way, seeking out The Omen was sort of like reclaiming that candy. I was tired of avoiding things because they might scare me. I wanted something, so I went up and got it. I took a chance on a movie that sounded terrifying, and ended up loving it. Opening myself up to movies and stories that, while scary, have deepened my appreciation of filmmaking and storytelling as a whole. That never would have happened if I'd stayed reluctant on watching The Omen. And for that, among all the numerous other people I have to thank, thanks, Mr. Donner. Rest in peace. See you again when I talk about the Goonies. By the way, if you so happen to live in one of the countries that has Star on Disney+, you can actually watch the complete Omen franchise on it. Except the fourth one they did on TV, but who cares? And I just find that so amusing. The Omen is on Disney+. The Omen is technically a Disney movie now. I guess God really does have a sense of humor.
I'm the mascot of an evil corporation.